Hello and welcome to this short introduction to Ancestor Veneration from a heathen perspective. My name is Dan Coultas. I'm the current chair of the Defence Pagan Network. I'm the Pagan Federation Disability Liaison for the North East, and with my wife Sabrina I run Heathens of Yorkshire. I'm very honoured to be asked to record this video today, which will be part of the Pagan Federation's Samhain online conference that we're hosting for this year. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give this introduction, which I'm giving now. I will then talk a little bit about the history of Ancestor Veneration in Heathenry, going back and looking at a few of the sources that we've got from the time. I'll then have a bit of a discussion about what is an ancestor, because like everything in heathenry, not as straightforward as we'd like it to be. I'll then talk a bit about modern practice and what the majority of heathens do these days to honour their ancestors, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own personal experience and my own UPG and the practice that I do myself. So to start off with then, the history of ancestor veneration. From what we can tell, it has always been an important part of heathenry going back. So when we look at the sort of core tenets of heathenry that have survived through the literature, we see that one of the things that's very, very important is reputation. And one of the reasons that reputation is so important is that it doesn't just stay with you in life, it stays with you after death. So you want to build the best possible reputation that you can to ensure that you'll still be remembered after death. And one of the reasons we do this, or the heathens back in the day did this, we believe as well, is that they believe that as long as they were still being talked about, they were still being remembered. So that is why, well, one of the reasons why, heathens back in the day continued to honour people after they had died. And there's plenty of evidence that points towards this happening. So one of the interesting sources that we can look at is Njál's saga. Now in Njál's saga, there is a story, part of the saga, whereby singing is heard from a burial mound at night, and it actually disturbs the passers-by with this singing that they're hearing. And it's believed that this singing was part of honouring the ancestors that were buried in the mound. We've also got an interesting story of King Halfdan, excellent name, very similar to mine, whereby King Halfdan was a very, very prosperous king, and under his leadership and his rule, the land was very fertile and his kingdom was very, very successful as a result. Now, when he died, he was again buried in a mound, and there's evidence to suggest that his people believed that the influence that he'd had over the land and the fertility during his life could continue after his death. So they continued to leave him offerings, say prayers to him and worship him in the hope that he would continue to exert that influence that he had during his life. So we've got both literary and archaeological evidence of this as well. So there's some very interesting archaeological sites, such as the stone ships that can be found in Gotland is one example, but there are others, where the archaeology suggests that there were items buried with the individual inside of the ship. But what's interesting is they found items outside of the ship or outside of the burial mound, which clearly come from a later date, but they follow the pattern of offerings that have been made or found to the gods and to the spirits elsewhere. So it shows, we believe, that these offerings were being made at the mounds of the ancestors as an offering to them. As I've said, already mentioned on some of the literary examples, there are plenty out there in the sagas. Not going to go into all of that today because obviously this is just a brief introductory video. So moving on now, so I said what is an ancestor is not necessarily as straightforward as we'd like it to be. So most heathens agree, modern heathens, and it looks like the ancient heathens agree, that ancestor veneration is very important. But who are we actually honouring here? So obviously you've got your direct lineage. So anyone in your direct line going back through grandparents, great-grandparents, who has directly influenced or directly passed down DNA to you. So they obviously are an ancestor. But the vast majority of heathens believe that there are ancestors of that bloodline, but you also have ancestors of marriage. Doesn't make them any less of an ancestor because they've married into your family. Ancestors of friendship. Other people that maybe you've known in your life that have had an influence on you that have now moved on. There's no reason why they can't be considered an ancestor just because they're not in your direct bloodline. Basically, anyone who has come before us and has had an influence on our life should be considered as an ancestor. Obviously in heathenry, the web of weird is a very important concept. We believe that everyone is connected through this web, and every interaction that we have has an influence. So we're not just looking at direct family members when we're looking back to the ancestors. The other interesting point when we come to see or talk about what is an ancestor is that there seems to be a blending between what is an ancestor and what is a spirit, and sometimes even what is a god. So I'll come back to what is a god in the connection there in a bit, but we'll start off with the connection with the spirits of the land, the elves, the wights, the landvatir. So this isn't just a modern concept that there's a blending. If you look back to the saga of Olaf the Holy, now Olaf himself was one of the very first Christian kings. But he lived in a time where heathen practices were still common, and indeed his very recent ancestors had been heathen themselves. Now his father was also King Olaf, but in the saga of Olaf the Holy, they go past his burial mound, and he is referred to in Icelandic, but I won't try to attempt the pronunciation, as Olaf the Elf of Gerstadt. So at this point, not only are they recognising that he was the father of the current King Olaf, he was a human, he has died, but now he's being referred to as an elf. So as well as being an ancestor, there's that tie over there where part of his being has actually joined the world of the elves and is now an influential landvatir, as well as being influential in the line of the Olafs. Now, for those of you who are heathen or who have studied heathenry, you'll know that we don't believe in a straightforward sort of body and soul self. So heathens generally believe that the self is made up of many parts. Again, which I won't go into in this video. There's plenty of other places you can read about that, or other videos that will explain it. But what we're looking at here is the fact that part of Olaf, or the elder, shall we call him, part of his self has, we think, stayed in the burial mound, because there's talk in the story of him, you know, having a presence there. But part of his self has also become a landvatir, or become an elf. So when we look at the ancestors, there is that crossover and that blending there. We're not just looking at one certain group and saying these are the ancestors, these are the elves. Another point, as I said, I'd touch on what is an ancestor versus what is a god. Because in heathenry, there is a very famous story laid down in the Eddas that the god Rig, who we believe was actually Heimdall in disguise, came down to earth, and he spent the night with 3 different couples, and after each time he spent the night with a couple, the lady, the wife, was then with child. So, and those the descendants of those 3 couples then went on to populate the earth, which would mean, of course, that every single one of us is a direct descendant, when we go back far enough, to Heimdall. So that means that when we are looking at ancestors, we can also actually, if we want to, we can look at including the gods in that group as well. So all of this means that it's not a straightforward a thing at all. Now, how does this reflect on modern practice? Now, when a lot of people first start getting into heathenry, and they hear about ancestor veneration, of course their mind goes straight to the ancestors who were alive in the heathen period. So they're thinking of Viking warriors, they're thinking of Viking kings, they're thinking of their families and all the things that were done in Northern Europe and Scandinavia at that time. Now, of course, those are our ancestors. Those are important people that we should be looking to honour and to venerate. But of course, they're not the only ones. You see a lot of sort of memes and things on the internet. They'll be like, oh, remember that 99% of your ancestors were pagan. Well, yes, that may well be true. I mean, the stats probably, just pulled out of the air the percentage, but yes, a lot of them will have been. But the vast majority of our recent ancestors won't have been. Now, I personally believe, and I think a lot of heathens would agree, that that is no reason to discount them from our practice at all. The reason that we, as modern heathens, want to honour our ancestors is, like many aspects of heathenry, a two-way street. Now, we believe in the gifting cycle of a gift for a gift, so we don't just ask for something. If we're going to ask for something, we always make an offering beforehand, and equally, if we're giving thanks for something, we don't just say thank you, we give a gift. Now, you can't guarantee in this gifting cycle that the other party is going to want to partake. And quite often, when you have a problem, you want to look to the being, the deity, whatever you want to call it, that is most likely to want to help you. Now, when you look at who is likely to have a vested interest in your cause, your recent ancestors particularly are ones who are most likely to want to help you. Because as I said, going back to what the ancient heathens did and looking all the way through, we help them by telling their stories, by keeping them alive, by keeping their reputation going so that they continue to live. And if we're doing that, in return, they can help us with our problems. So a lot of our sort of everyday mundane problems that we have in life, if you go straight to the great gods of Asgard, they might want to help you. You might have built up a particular connection with a god or a goddess, but the likelihood is they've probably got other things on their minds, and they're going to have loads and loads of people coming to them wanting help or advice with anything. Whereas your recent ancestors, only a few people are going to be telling their stories. Only a few people are going to be keeping them alive. So they have got a vested interest in your life and your success, because our reputations are tied, as well, as I said earlier, with a web of word. Success for us is success for them. They want us to do well, so therefore they're going to want to help us with our problems, because we'll then keep their stories alive and keep them going. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be honouring our ancient ancestors, known or unknown. We may know their names, we may not. Of course we should still be leaving offerings for them, because we are the product of 1,000 lives and 1,000 loves. But we really, really should not be discounting our recent ancestors, and if anything, we should be putting those, in my opinion, at the forefront of our practice. Now, what is that practice for modern heathens? What can we do? Well, Mother's Night is an important part of modern practice, and that's where we remember all of our female ancestors who have made us what they are, our mothers' mothers, who've nurtured us. So something that we do in our household, and I know that it's done in many heathen households, is to hold a specific ritual on Mother's Night to honour the Disir, as we call the female ancestors. And what we like to do in our house is we have a list of all the female ancestors that we know of, going back through our family trees in the house, and we will hold a ritual whereby we will read out the names of all of those ancestors, and we will make offerings to them. And of course the offerings that we make, where we can, will be specific to the individuals that we know. Obviously, the further we go back, the less we know about the individuals, but the more recently deceased, will either have known them in life, or will have known people who have known them in life, will have known what they liked, will have known what they will have achieved, and the offerings that we make will be specific to that. Another time to honour the ancestors, obviously around this time of year we have the Winter Nights Festival, and something that we do is to honour the ancestors then, to keep them in our thoughts and in our hearts, and leaving food offerings to them can be really important. This can be done both at Winter Nights, it can also be done at Yule. So what we'll do at Yule is we'll make up our feast table, and we'll set a place. And this again I know is done in many heathen households, whereby you'll set up a full place setting for the ancestors and ensure that they have the finest cuts. You know, they have the best vegetables, they have the best meat if you're a meat eater, they have a full glass of mead or wine or whatever you're having. And this ties in heathenry in general. It's important when you're making offerings not to you know, give the dog ends, not to give the bits that you wouldn't want, to give the best things, because this is you remembering that the ancestors are still in your home, they're still influencing your life, and you're remembering them and you're honouring them, and you're setting a place at the table for them to come and to join you and to sit once again with the family, as one day when we've moved on they will welcome us into the halls beyond and we'll sit down with them. So that's touched on some sort of general modern heathen practices towards the ancestors. I'd like to talk a little bit now about some of my specific ancestors, because I believe, and I think a lot of heathens also believe, that telling their stories, as I've said earlier, is one of the most important ways to keep them alive. So whilst I've got this opportunity to talk to a lot of people, hopefully via this video, I'm going to do just that. And there's two people that I'm going to talk about specifically that are ancestors that in particular have a big influence on my life. So the first I'm going to talk to you about is my great-grandfather. I've got his photograph here. This is Ernest Coultas. Now, Ernest Coultas served in the Merchant Navy in both the First and the Second World War. In the Second World War, he won 2 medals for bravery. The first was the OBE, which he won for saving his ship from U-boat attack. He was actually the captain of the only ship to survive the first ever German Wolfpack attack. And the way he did this was, instead of trying to run away, he steamed full speed towards the U-boat, which was then forced to dive, and he was able to save his ship. And not only did this save his ship, for which he was awarded the OBE, this was then adopted as a recognised practice. And as well as that, Ernest also won the Meritorious Medal for Service at Sea for the Sicily landings towards the end of the war, where he was the captain of a ship that was dropping off landing craft. And when he got to the position where he was supposed to drop them off, he decided that the brave chaps in the landing craft would have no chance from there. So he drove his ship much closer to the shore under heavy gunfire from the defences on the island, to ensure that he gave the troops in the landing craft the best possible chance of getting ashore and surviving. So some of you, well, those of you who know me will know, the sea is very much a part of my background. It's what I do for a living. Which is one of the reasons why Ernest is such an influential ancestor in my life. I look to him for inspiration, and I give thanks to him for guiding me in my own career at sea. A few years back, at one of the Asgardian heathen festivals, I attended a very interesting ancestry workshop led by Frigga Asraf. And in this workshop, part of what we did was to do a path working when we went to speak with our ancestors, and it was actually Ernest that I was able to sort of make contact with through that that path working, and not only was that a very affirming moment in my heathenry, but it was a very important moment in my own development, I think, and in building that bond with him, and therefore enabling my own progression. So so hugely important. Now the other ancestor that I'd like to talk about is actually my mother-in-law, Maggie. Now obviously, as mother-in-law, not an ancestor through direct bloodline, but an ancestor through marriage, and also, you know, through our own friendship. I know traditionally you're not supposed to like your mother-in-law, but when Maggie was alive, me and her were great friends, and she really was an inspiration. She sadly lost her battle with cancer last year, but all through her treatment she was incredibly brave, and always happy and laughing and smiling right up to the end. And again, a real personal inspiration. And now that she's moved on, I don't see any reason for our personal friendship to change. I still leave offerings to her. I still like to sit quietly and think about her, and try and continue the conversations that we used to have, and draw on the inspiration that she's given me to continue to be strong and keep a sense of humour in the face of adversity, because if you can't laugh, what can you do? So that pretty much concludes this talk. I hope it's been interesting and enjoyable. As I said, it's only a brief introduction. There are so many more literary sources I could have gone into in terms of ancient heathenry and ancestor veneration practices back then. What I will do is I will recommend this book, Wights and Ancestors, Heathenry in a Living Landscape. This is by Jenny Blaine. As you can see, it's only a little book, and it retails for $7.99, so it's easily accessible, but it's a very well written book that it talks a bit about ancestor veneration, both ancient and modern, and it talks about the connection between ancestors, wights, gods, etc. It's a nice little read, and it'll cover some of the stuff that we've talked about in this in a bit more detail. Otherwise, as I say, there are plenty of references in the sagas if you want to dig through those, and any book on sort of the basics and principles of heathenry will almost certainly have a chapter on ancestor veneration in there. So the final thing I'm going to do, I'm going to close with a prayer that I've written to the ancestors, and it's called Our Ever-Present Guides. We call to the ancestors, those who have come before us, who continue to guide us to become the best we can be, whether as warriors, as farmers, as mothers. Whatever your trade, your deeds, you not only provide us with an example, but you continue to actively guide us in our lives, watching over your descendants as your own children. We are the products of your loves and your lives, and we shall do our utmost to uphold your honour and reputations. Hail the ancestors. Thank you very much.